Let's talk for a moment about threat and fear, because I think that most of you in practical work, what you'll be in touch with, and I'm sorry to my workshop group, we've talked about this in detail, I have to mention it here anyway. Fear is a key element of what you have in all societies, conflict and post-conflict society. Fear is a normal mechanism through which we protect ourselves. Fear, in psychological terms, allows us to react to threats quicker than we can think. Something attacks me, I go back, and I haven't even thought about it. Actually, I've moved back before I've thought I should move back. So fear reactions are learned, function on the basis of learned behavior, which allow us to function more rapidly than we normally do in the threatening situations. So fear usually is an emotion that doesn't stay with us. It's an emotion we have for a moment, and then we react, and then it goes away. So far, so good. Fear is something very nice and helpful. But when you live in circumstances where fear is a constant aspect of reality, because threat is a constant aspect of reality, then fear becomes chronic. And chronic fear, as the basis for social interaction, becomes an aspect profoundly threatening in individual and collective aspects. Chronic fear, instead of making you able to react to threat, makes you less able to react to threat. Instead of going out and crying for help, you shut up more even than you ever done before. And whatever you repress in one moment comes out in the wrong other moment. Your capacity to judge threats gets worse. And worst of all, the things you have learned under chronic fear stay with you long after the actual threat has disappeared. And that is very, very important to understand what happens in post-conflict settings. For example, in Chile, way into the transition to democracy, actually with already the second president elected, there was a moment where there was some tension in the military. Nothing really relevant. Some internal discussion, somebody had been taken prison, they didn't like it, the president was outside of the country, and there was some inner military discussion. Nevertheless, the fact that that happened provoked levels of fear in the population which were absolutely impressive. Because against any kind of political logic, everybody thought, a coup could happen again. Politically, it was absurd. But psychologically, it was not absurd, because everybody living there had incorporated fear and the threat of military action in a long, long process of learning. Also, I told you I lived in Chile many years, 17 years actually, during the dictatorship and after. And if you had asked me at some point during the dictatorship, how many dead people do you think, how many people the dictatorship killed? I would have, like most people, told you, look, I don't really know, but I guess somewhere between 40,000 to 100,000. Everybody believed that. When you look at publications of that time, you'll find these numbers. In fact, that was wrong. In fact, you have in Chile about 8,000 dead. 5,000 disappeared, 3,000 executed and killed, about 8,000. Now, the point is not if 40,000 is less or more terrible than 8,000 or whatever. The point is, everybody believed that it was 40 to 100,000. And this belief was installed because the Chilean dictatorship was extremely successful and installing collective fear in everybody. For every person they killed, in public perception, 5 were killed. And that was very, very successful. And political propaganda works a lot with that. So fear structures, chronification of fear, and the fact that fear stays with you and fear reactions stay with you even long after the threat has disappeared is a very, very important element which we deal with in, if we look at psychosocial dimensions of conflict. This is also relevant when you want to convince people that they should vote, for example. If people have had a long experience that voting is worth nothing, because your vote doesn't get respected anyway because they falsify the results. Secondly, if they've learned that if they vote for the wrong person, they might get killed. Thirdly, if they've learned that saying your opinion might cost your life, then elections, once they're decreed by the International Peacemaker Brigade, might be a very threatening event. And you might not like it at all. And many people might be very resistant to it, not because they wouldn't want to vote or have a decision at some time, but basically because they're convinced that this might harm them. So when you think about elections, you might as well try to imagine what does it mean for people. And if you start thinking that, you might, with good reason, discover that it's not only about political power, but it's also about strange things like learning processes of fear. Now, let me get to the issue of trauma, and I'm going to spend quite some time on this, so please bear with me. I think that when we speak of trauma theory, we have to start from the idea that we have a double genealogy or a double identity of trauma theory. On one side, we can see that trauma theory develops, like other scientific theories, in a scientific development. 200 years ago, people thought this. 100 years ago, they thought that, and so slowly it's been developing. But that's just one side of it. The other side of it, and I'll explain that in a second, is that theory has not only developed within scientific logic, actually trauma theory has developed also according to societal conflicts. Secondly, trauma theory on one side is a clinical term, but it is also and has always been a moral category in a given social-political situation. Actually, we can't speak about trauma without making some kind of judgment of what we think of victims, or who we think victims are, or who we think deserves the term trauma or not. So you will see me now discuss the history of the development of the term trauma. And I'll try to show you this strange double identity of trauma. I'll start out with scientific development. First of all, we have this original metaphor of the tier between self and reality, of the idea, sort of the quantitative idea, which is like when lightning strikes you. The original idea of trauma is that you have an experience that is so overpowering that you sort of fall apart. That's the original idea. But then, very soon, they sort of found out that this whole thing isn't so easy. And then we have this strange original history which is associated to the term seduction theory, which, as some of you might know, when Freud discovered his things, he thought originally that most of his clients, women, had suffered sexual abuse. And that because of the sexual abuse they suffered, they developed symptoms later on. So the initial idea, called seduction theory of trauma, is that this was an overpowering experience which then later on provoked hysteria. Now, the problem was that even then, Freud very soon discovered that the onset of symptoms didn't occur when the event occurred. So you have this thing called deferred action, or in German Nachträglichkeit, where he had clients who apparently suffered a traumatic experience as a child, but symptoms set on when they were 17 or 18 or 20 years old. So Freud came up with a strange theory in which he said, when the child is small, it still doesn't have a grown-up sexuality. Therefore, the sexual abuse doesn't have a traumatic effect immediately, because there is no sexuality that can be traumatized. But then the child grows up, and then as it grows up, a sexuality develops, and then sort of in deferred action, in a sort of strange lapse back into history, what the child experienced 6 years ago becomes traumatic. So we have a time frame entering trauma theory rather early on. But then Freud said, can't be that all my clients were sexually abused as children. So he said, somehow that's not satisfactory. And he decided, well, maybe they weren't all abused, but maybe some of them had fantasies and wishes about being abused, or having relationships or whatever. So he started focusing more on inner fantasies of children. Now, he didn't abandon this whole initial theory completely, but he stopped talking about it, and he focused more on inner relationships. And then he ended up discovering this Oedipal theories, but basically what he discovered was infantile sexuality. What he discovered was that adult sexuality evidently is something that comes very late, but that children, 2, 3, 4 years old, also have a sexuality, infantile sexuality, and that this implies they have wishes, they have dreams, they have very intense feelings, and that these can also lead them to very contradictory reactions and also lead them to psychological illness. So now you had two theories. One was about bad parents abusing children. And then you had a second theory which said, oops, children have a sexuality also. But both theories together, people couldn't think of it at that time. And I think actually they still can't think of it nowadays. Because nowadays, when you follow the discussion on sexual abuse, it very often is the same thing again. It's either bad parents and children which are little angels, or it's children that have wishes and then the parents can't be so bad. While if we look at it from nowadays theory, it's obvious that children have a sexuality, but yes, we have bad parents. And when adults abuse the capacity of love children have, then they destroy their sexuality. and then they destroy something for a long-range moment. But in order to be destroyed, the children don't need to be, you know, angels. Quite to the contrary. Like everybody else, they can have feelings. But at that time, that wasn't really something people were able to digest. Seduction theory was complicated, child sexuality was complicated. So then you have a contemporary of Freud, who was Ferenczi. And Ferenczi, he thought that Freud got a little bit lost, and he said, Ferenczi actually thought that abuse was happening, and he thought that not all clients were sexually abused, but many of them. And he thought that you have to be very careful, because the dependency between an abused child and the abuser is often so big that the abused child will learn the language of the abuser and will start speaking the language of the victimizer. And he said, careful, when we are working with victims, be careful, don't think that the victim actually is the perpetrator, but hear how the perpetrator has entered into the mind of the victim and help her get out of it again. He was actually a very capable thinker. And Ferenczi discovered something furthermore, which is very important in trauma theory. He discovered that in trauma, you're either inside the trauma or outside the trauma. And when you're outside the trauma, you can talk about it. And when you're inside the trauma, you can't talk about it, but you can feel it. And when you're outside the trauma, you can talk about it, but you can't really feel it. That was his dilemma. And this is really important, because many of you will have heard about it. Very often we think somebody who is traumatized should be able to sit in front of us like in the movies, you know, like with a tearful, horrible reaction, falling apart, crying, shouting, whatever. That happens. But what happens much more frequently is that you find somebody who will talk about their trauma as if they're talking about eating a hamburger or buying at the supermarket. Because in trauma, dissociation takes place. Ferenczi discovered that. And a little later, in England, people like Balint, Winnicott, and Kahn developed what is now considered comparatively modern trauma theory, in which the event, the threatening event that overpowers you, isn't forgotten, but it is actually understood that trauma occurs always in a relational context. And thus, trauma becomes an event that is overpowering you, but it is also basically a relational history. And trauma, in their theory, thus becomes more important, the traumatic situation, as a relational issue. So there you have a certain development, a scientific development. Now let me take you through the same development in terms of societal development, or in terms of, first of all, in trauma theory you have train accidents, working accidents, and shell-shocked soldiers. That's when it all starts out. Train accidents, 19th century England, working accidents in industrialized Germany, and shell-shocked soldiers in World War I. And what do you have as a discussion around it? You have the question of insurance frauds. You have the idea that traumatized people are simulators. And you have the accusation that traumatized soldiers are cowards. So actually, historically, the whole trauma discussion begins as a discussion about manipulation. And the initial techniques, hypnosis and so on, are also about manipulation and influencing. And you have got some nicer techniques to treat trauma, like hypnosis, and you've got some more terrible techniques like cold showers or electroshocks, which are all thinking that traumatized people pretend that they have a problem. So the focus, the societal focus initially, is on certain problems of industrialization. Industry produces victims, the bad English trains produce victims, and insurances ask themselves, do they have to pay? And soldiers aren't working properly, and you have a society discussing how they judge victims, and basically saying that victims are sort of more simulators than really victims. And this changes after the Holocaust. Because in a certain way, and it's not an easy change, but in a certain way after the Holocaust, for the first time you have the recognition of the victims. Their testimony becomes important because the Nazis committed their crimes in such a horrendous way and with the illusion that they'd be able to kill all of them, so there wouldn't be any testimony. And suddenly the survivors of concentration camps become very important in justice. And for the first time, and it takes a long time actually, there's a lot of fights, and I'm not going to get you into all the details, but actually in a certain way, after the Holocaust, for the first time, we have a growing consciousness of victims, that victims of trauma are not simulators. They are not people who are not willing to, they're not people who choose their suffering, but they're suffering and they're witnesses, in this case, to horrendous crimes. And there is the need to validate them and what they have to say. And this happens post-Holocaust. It's not the only factor that happens, because also in terms of movements in the 60s and 70s towards child abuse and towards feminist movement dealing with victims of rape and gender-based violence, push in the same direction, which all focus on the recognition of victims. Now, this is not a scientific development, it's a social development. And the change that you have also in treatment strategies is not produced by the logics of science, but by the logics of politics. And then finally you have the Vietnam War, and you have the problems of soldiers coming back from the Vietnam War and being frightfully ill. And this requires the invention of a new illness, which we call PTSD, post-traumatic stress disorder. Now, the original problem is that a soldier who behaves mentally in a strange way after being discharged, what you need is to prove that what happened, his mental illness, is a product of what happened to him in the war while he was a soldier. Otherwise, the state isn't responsible. So you need an illness that makes a connection between the mental behavior of the soldiers and what happened in war for them. And I'll explain that in a minute, but what happens actually is that with PTSD, we get the first big, huge worldwide trauma theory. But that theory, what it does is, in difference to what happened after the Holocaust, where victims began to become valued, after the Vietnam War, we have sort of a demoralization of the trauma issue. We have less morals into it, and suddenly victims and victimizers, victims and perpetrators, everybody can be traumatized. And once everybody is traumatized, we sort of can even make nicer people out of victimizers. That's actually a fact. So in a certain way, the morals change significantly in the connection of ending the Vietnam War. Now, At this stage, I have to make a jump into imperial theory, and I have to talk about Frantz Fanon. Anybody here knows Frantz Fanon? Frantz Fanon was a psychologist, psychiatrist. He was black. He came from Martinique. He was French. He worked in Algeria during the revolution and the independence from colonialism. And Frantz Fanon, some people think that he is sort of a defender of violence. If you ever read his work, you'll see that it's actually not in favor, it's very much against violence. But what he describes is violent reality. And he describes violent reality, and I think we cannot talk about conflict situations without looking basically at two people, at Frantz Fanon and at Edward Said. We have to talk about colonialism and post-colonialism. And I think there's no way we can continue to talk about neither psychological nor other dimensions without making reference to these people. Now, Frantz Fanon, he described the dilemma of people trying to liberate themselves. He described that the black person is black because whites have decided that the black person is black. Now, if the black person wants to discover his or her own identity, he's trapped, because he can try to say, I'll try to discover my true blackness, but the definition of blackness, or the question, only arose because somebody made him black. And if he tries to be something else, like white, he can't either. So whatever he does, he's forced into a question of alienation produced by the colonial relationship. And by the way, Fanon describes this in a very scary way. He describes how children in Martinique, black children, middle-class children who think they're French, go to school and write little essays how they spent the summer, and where they say, we ran across the field and our rosy cheeks were glowing, and so on. And you see there's a whole education that treats them in a way where they think, in quote-unquote, they're white. But they're not white. They're black, and they're being treated as black in the moment it becomes relevant. And by the way, some of you might like Camus. I like Camus. But when you read Camus about Algeria, you might once think also how much racial prejudices you can find in Camus, which are profoundly scary, actually. Which explains also why Camus always thought that Algeria shouldn't be independent, which maybe some of you don't know. Anyway, Fanon discovers that this question of identity building, for example, for blacks, is unavoidably linked to colonial experience and to a trap which is not at all easily overcome. Because you can't get rid of the colonial reality, but you cannot also define yourself independent of it. And the second thing is that he says that the key gift of the colonial powers to the colonized people has been violence. And that in that sense, what we call civilization in its essence is barbarianism. Now, Edward Said, the famous literary theorist who wrote this wonderful book on Orientalism, worked, and the theory of Orientalism is the way the West invents Orient for themselves. I don't know if anybody of you likes music, but if you ever come to Berlin, you should go to the Opera House, and you should see The Magic Flute by Mozart, which is a very funny play anyway, because this opera supposedly happens, you know, somewhere, could happen somewhere close to Egypt. Anyway, in 19th century Germany, they thought that. And they thought that they were doing the stage in a very realistic Oriental way. And when you go see that opera today, it's very funny, because the man who planned the opera stage for the magic flute in the 19th century was an architect called Schinkel. And Schinkel made lots of buildings in Berlin. And when you come today, you can go to the opera, you can see what he thought was Oriental, which was his buildings with a couple of palm trees. And so you can go to the opera, you can see the opera house and all the houses around in Berlin, which are Schinkel houses. And then inside you can see an image of the Oriental world, which is the same thing, only that they thought that this is the Orient. And I always thought it's a very graphic way of seeing what Edward Said is talking about. But Edward Said, in a certain way, is a little bit more friendly. He confirms Fanon's theory that empire is a cultural reality even long after colonial times have gone by. And he says we have to be conscious of the fact that history cannot be understood only in terms of time, we have to understand it also in terms of space. And I wrote relevance in a wrong way. But he says there's no way out of the dilemma Fanon described. He says what we have to deal with is the fact that colonials and colonized and colonizators are inevitably entangled with each other. So nowhere, no place are we going to get clean cultural identities. We'll get mixtures, we'll get conflict, we'll get hybrid situations, we'll get ways in which we will always discover the traces of the others in us. And he says, if we're good at it, we can discover these traces. In theories and in praxis, we can always do something he calls contra punctual reading, and for music lovers that means we can discover the other melody, the official melody and the melody below. So, back to trauma. Trauma needs to deal always with the question between inside and outside, always with time, and always with context. Any trauma theory needs to solve these issues. And now, thinking of Edward Said, let's have a look at PTSD diagnosis. And let's see what it does. It says post, although in most socio-political traumatizations there is no post. Or have you ever seen, you know, that a disappeared person suddenly reappears, or that, you know, wars just stop? Secondly, it talks about stress, although stress is definitely too weak when we talk about trauma. Thirdly, PTSD talks about disorder, although anybody who's ever dealt with people who have been traumatized in the context of political repression know that what they hate most is to be treated as ill. They want to be acknowledged as victims of human rights violations, not as psychologically ill. Thirdly, PTSD has an incomplete list of symptoms. It's unfortunately completely individual diagnosis, no possibility to understand families or transgenerational process. It's culturally completely ignorant. It doesn't make any difference to what happens where, to whom. You can have a car accident in Switzerland, or you can be in a concentration camp in Germany, or you can be killed in a war in Sierra Leone. To PTSD, it's all the same, different kind of stress symptoms.